Tonight we talk about greenwashing and how blockchain technology can help to counter that. The thing is, I know many people know this, but in my old life I used to be a consultant working for an environmental consultancy. So I've been in the sustainability space before I was reborn and went down the blockchain rabbit hole, never to return. And the funny thing is, when you talk to people in the blockchain space and tell them, hey, we have some environmental issues pending, they tell you, oh, climate change is not real. Okay, why is it getting hotter every year then? If you go to the environmental space and you tell them, listen, blockchain is a great tool to use for sustainability, they will tell you, no, because Bitcoin uses so much electricity. But the reality is that Web3, the space, is created to cut out the middleman and to create trust. So the same mechanism that is used to create Bitcoin to avoid a bank or a financial intermediate in the middle can be used for any other sustainability related topic. This could be on-chain carbon credit, this could be sustainability reporting, or this could be renewable energy production. This is why ImpactScope is a very special project. I am glad that they made all the way from France and not from Bulgaria and are here with us tonight. Please, everyone, a warm welcome for ImpactScope, Michele.
Thank you, thanks everybody. Thanks, Ferres, for introducing, and yeah, apologies if I may have some down here and there. I was taking the plane 7 a.m. this morning to come here, so yeah, please understand in advance. So yeah, I'm Michele Soavi, co-founder of ImpactScope, where basically we leverage blockchain and AI for sustainability solution. I've also some kind of more institutional roles. I'm the chair of the sustainability working group at Crypto Valley Association, the biggest Swiss association. And I'm doctoral supervisor at Business School Lausanne around this kind of topics. And yeah, even though, you know, Ferres was mentioning question of all-time high Bitcoin energy consumption, we are not talking about that tonight. You know, I feel like many times there's way too much discussion just around, you know, the question of the energy consumption of Bitcoin. But I think there's other elements to be considered. And I mean, the way I would like to start is from, you know, somehow the business perspective, somehow the struggle that has been for many European companies in the last years, basically, which, you know, on the one hand, it's understandable because, okay, whether you believe it or not, climate change is a reality and therefore we have to do something. But on the other hand, what has been happening in the European Union is that there has been a lot of burden when it comes to regulation. And you may be aware last year there was the Draghi report on the competitiveness of the European Union. And basically it was pointing at the fact, you know, that the increasing number of regulations were making more and more difficult for European companies to be able to be competitive in the global market. So, you know, what's coming up? Sustainability reporting. I'm coming, you know, I used to work for PwC and Ernst & Young in financial reporting, and I understand the challenge of coming up with accounting methods that can be applied to the financial sector, and there are still some uncertainties there. And now, you know, we are somehow rushing to be able to come up with sustainability reporting, to be able somehow to monitor also for environmental impact. Another element, you know, more and more regulatory and as well market pressure for CO2 offsetting and insetting. You know, basically offsetting means planting trees or, you know, polluting and then compensating for the pollution, whereas insetting refers to somehow change internal procedure to limit CO2 emissions. Then greenwashing regulation, it's another one that came up somehow recently last year around this month, which is somehow relying on the EU green taxonomy that is somehow helping to define what is green, what can be labeled as green and what cannot be labeled as green. CBAM, that basically carbon border adjustment mechanism with the idea of somehow having companies to pay when they export their CO2 emissions. Then another one, EU restoration law, another one which will imply the need to somehow being able to to perform monitoring, reporting, and verification of environmental assets. So that's somehow something very complicated. And on the other hand, I mean, sustainability also is a business opportunity as well, from the perspective, increasing need to manage CO2 emissions. And well, I should look into updated figures for 2024, but basically, carbon offsetting market during 2023 was corresponding to approximately 100 billions. And just to be aware, just 23% of all CO2 emissions are somehow under some pricing mechanism. Therefore, I mean, it's easy to make the calculation and see globally, if all carbon emissions would be priced, the price would be corresponding to a bit more than $400 billion a year. And then, I mean, that's very relevant when it comes to blockchain considerations. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about CO2 emissions, market price, offsetting, but there is a gray market with a lot of lack in transparency in a market in which, to offset for a ton of CO2, you may pay as little as 2 euros per ton and as much as 80 euros per ton. So giving, a lot of room for arbitrage or some kind of opportunistic behavior for a market that still lacks a lot from transparency. And that's why there has been a lot of blockchain initiatives that have been focusing on basically putting carbon offsets on the CO2, on the blockchain. And that's somehow, coming back to the problem of double spending in a way for carbon emissions, in the sense that what probably happens many times is like, companies are planting trees to do carbon offsetting, and the same tree is sold to different companies. In the sense it's difficult to trace one-on-one the emissions being offset basically to the company offsetting. Therefore, that's why blockchain ended up being a good solution for CO2 assets. And I mean, mentioning about assets, we are somehow involved in the investment asset management industries. It's nice to see that companies are somehow transitioning from focusing on climate change to focusing on biodiversity indicators, which, become very complex, but on the other hand, they have a more holistic approach that makes sense from a sustainability perspective, but still, the framework pretty much does not exist, or it's really limited for different type of assets other than CO2 emissions. And maybe you may be aware, basically these imply a huge data charge, burden for companies. I've been working, with companies having to set up their sustainability reports and, lacking methods, lacking methodologies, lacking research, and basically struggling to do that. And, having also the risk of doing greenwashing, because they basically have to disclose about data. They're not really very confident on, you know, the data and the estimate they made. I mean, just so that you are aware, life cycle analysis is somehow the reference when it comes to carbon emission accounting or other types of biodiversity measures accounting. There has been other approaches, I mean, really nice, but still very complicated, like integrated reporting with the idea of, let's say, creating reporting from a company and basically talking about value creation along, you know, the financial assets they create, as well as the other assets that they use, like the natural capital as well. There has been some effort to integrate it into IFRS, you know, the most globally used standards with IFRS Standard 1 and Standard 2. But yeah, still many difficulties are existing when it comes to creating sustainability reports. And that's somehow something we try to work out. That's basically our thesis at, you know, ImpactScope to support sustainability project, leveraging, you know, blockchain, the shared electronic register that is, you know, for example, for the case of tokenization of carbon credits, there is something that, you know, by nature, it's somehow helping to avoid double spending, even though there are, from my perspective, there are still some difficulties when it comes to using blockchain to trace physical assets, you know, existing in the real world, like, you know, planted trees or some kind of other sustainability initiatives. Well, you know, I guess I'm not spending much here, you know, on the quality of being able to put CO2 emissions on the blockchain and having these kind of elements. And, you know, something very interesting, somehow in opposition to the artificial intelligence, is, you know, the deterministic outcome of blockchain based on smart contract. Therefore, you know, once the logic on the blockchain is the same, with the same input, you will always obtain the same output, which, you know, is not something that you can say with most of artificial intelligence modules. Some of them are somehow deterministic, like natural language processing, which is still very valid and was existing well before, you know, OpenAI and these kind of tools. But yeah, when it comes to generative AI, there is still a lot of variability when it comes to results. And basically, without going into technical terms, just by changing the temperature of an artificial intelligence model, you can get very different results. And basically, the temperature means having the module which is less or more creative. And so basically the idea, and that's something we have been working on also from a research point of view. So on the one hand, it's interesting to see that they can be very complementary because, you know, on the one hand you have the blockchain, which is the permanent record. You know, the information, once the information is stored there, will always be there, cannot be changed. And on the other side of the spectrum, there is artificial intelligence, you know, that obtains great results, but the problem for the time being is that you don't actually know how you obtain such results. And therefore, by complementing the two technologies, you can somehow create artificial intelligence on top of a blockchain layer that somehow helps bring transparency and explainability to artificial intelligence models. And then, I mean, another very important application, it's around decentralized AI, with the idea of, you know, making sure that basically who has the biggest energy, the biggest, energy, access to energy is somehow the one which is controlling the output of a process, because you may think that very similarly when it comes to, for example, Bitcoin consensus method, the one that has more energy is somehow the one that can control the process, whereas, somehow this is very similar to artificial intelligence, where there is a lot of concentration and a few big players are basically controlling the market. And basically using the two technologies together, somehow this problem can be solved. And it's something we explored at ImpactScope. So basically 2 years ago, we started to work around blockchain and AI. And the idea, we were working with a few financial regulators, among them the MFCA, the Malta Financial Services Authority, to help them identify greenwashing in an automatic or semi-automatic way. So to do that, we had to somehow come up with a framework that they could use, to define greenwashing, and we somehow adapted that to what was proposed by CFA, Certified Financial Accountant Institute, and basically, coming up with a definition of red flags for greenwashing that are somehow independent from the jurisdiction. Because, the problem with greenwashing, I guess, most of the people are aware what greenwashing is, but if I ask everybody individually what do they think greenwashing is, each of them, they come up with a different definition. So, this framework, I think, is somehow helpful in identifying what could be greenwashing. So, for example, contradiction, and it's something that we identify very early. We found, for example, in a company saying in the sustainability report, they were saying that by 2030 they want to become net zero, whereas in their Twitter report they said that they wanted to operate carbon neutral by the same year. So without going into technical details, those are very different, objectives, and that's clearly a case of greenwashing. On the other hand, you may understand that, or at least from our experience, many times, it's not necessarily companies willing, to do greenwashing to appear better than they are to the public and basically being able to sell more. But that could be also a question of company to struggle to align their internal communication. Whereas other types of greenwashing are somehow misleading statements, or vague terms. It's somehow very simple to understand and see that many times when it comes to sustainability reporting, you see a lot of blah blah without any kind of reference, to tangible actions, to targets, to percentage of improvement year on year. And it's something we have seen a lot with our tool. And then inconsistencies of different types. So for example, working on a model that would help identify inconsistencies within the images they bring, in their corporate narrative and what they actually do. So for example, we identified a company that basically had the wind turbines on the background of their sustainability report, but then if you go and read the sustainability report, they're not investing into wind turbines, therefore, that's some kind of greenwashing. And so basically, we came up with this tool called Greenwashing Identifier. And basically what we do is we access as much public data as possible from listed companies, because it's somehow easier to get public data for listed companies like financial report, sustainability report, environmental report, whatever, social media, and articles from companies. And basically we extract the text from such public data. We give it to the AI model that identify, the instances I was mentioning before, like contradictions among different data sources to somehow red flags of greenwashing. So there's like a qualitative part describing whatever, companies saying in a specific document something and in another document something completely different. And also basically the quantitative part, leveraging the AI module to query the data to identify some kind of scores that could help someone like a financial regulator compare different type of companies. And then, here with the blockchain element, we are basically saying saving the blockchain the greenwashing reports together with the data model and the data source used on the blockchain to somehow, we like to say, preserve the scene of the crime, and somehow being able to create a traceability element in AI solution, because that once the report is being generated, once what was the input you used, what was the model behind it, what was the outcome you created, you're somehow working on solving the black box of problem of artificial intelligence in the sense that you get great results, but you don't know how you obtain such results. So yeah, a bit aware of time, but I think I'm good. So what happens very often that we found, basically, scope 1, 2, or 3 CO2 emissions are somehow calculation of CO2 emissions associated just, basically to your company. Scope 1, scope 2 is the energy you produce, and scope 3 is your supply chain. And it may be for greenwashing, or it may be for changing methodologies, difficulties in calculating that. Basically, we find very often, year on year, the fact that such figures are amended. The opening balance for 2024 is not the closing balance for 2023. Then, for example, having very ambitious sustainability objectives, but then some were lost in the document mentioning that maybe you cannot afford it from a financial perspective. Same disclosures identified over and over again. Sometimes we found somehow in the same year, the same phrase or the same paragraph in 5 different documents. So very long documents, but basically always telling the same story. Improvement without data, which I was somehow mentioning before. Ambitious naming for targets that are somehow making people think about net zero, which is somehow the most ambitious sustainability target, but actually not doing that, or some of them which are more industry specific. And just to give you an idea what the tool can do, based on a combination of machine learning to basically train the model to identify environmental text in corporate communication, and some elements on NLP to identify contradictions between different phrases, some elements of generative AI to generate the qualitative report, and query basically the whole data set to be able to identify these kind of elements, like from a statistical perspective, recurring vague terms in the documents, or statistically again, lack of quantitative data, or external evaluations like given by third parties, or somehow the quality of audit reporting. So in a way, with the need to be able to compare different companies. And you may understand, as a financial regulator, you have thousands of companies to regulate, and you have to be aware where you can start somehow, and because you have just so many, and one way or another, pretty much all companies are doing greenwashing. And then, I mean, this is somehow the most interesting part, the part, you know, that is somehow, yeah, the one that I would like to leave for you, for your reflection. So thinking about where these kind of models can be used in other industries. So just to give you an idea, then imagine from our perspective, we were working on identifying contradiction between different data sources and basically comparing couple of phrases among each other to identify contradictions. Then, you know, you may extend that in something we have been looking into for other use cases, basically being able to query the data and compare it to a source of truth, which can be, you know, an accounting standard, or that can be, you know, some recommendation from the World Health Organization to somehow detect similar difficulties in completely different contexts. So, for example, we just participated to a request for proposal for UNICEF, basically, to develop a tool for Burkina Faso that would help basically identify sexual misinformation in influencer from Burkina Faso. And basically, you know, that we have a partner there, and you see a lot of influencers spreading false sexual information basically on the social media, and they need to find a way basically to being able to monitor that and flag that to take appropriate measures. And then again, it's up to you to think, you know, where you could use your this kind of approaches, you know, which are very data intensive, but they're really efficient, they work really well. And, you know, just to give, for example, another generic example, as I used to work for Ernst & Young and PwC in financial reporting, you may understand that as well, analysis of financial report to identify, you know, whether they're compliant with existing regulation, or, you know, whether one version was somehow modified compared to the previous one. Well, not everything. Well, yeah, there must be some thinking to be done, but yeah, those kind of models, they're working really well. And then, again, thinking where, you know, many times when it comes to artificial intelligence adoption, one of the challenges is related to the fact that the results are very interesting, but then for bias management or for traceability, for explainability, people generally struggle to justify how a solution was obtained. So in a way, by complementing the Web3 element with the blockchain element, again, you can create some element of traceability there, and being able, you know, to trace back somehow why a specific decision was taken by the artificial intelligence module. Or, yeah, for example, again, on the perspective of decentralized AI, where you don't want an AI module to be controlled, you know, by just the same usual big names. And well, I think I'm pretty much good with time. I'm happy to open up the floor for Q&A questions.
1 second.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
This might have been a lot to take in, but I assure you this was super, super relevant for anyone who spent some time in sustainability reporting, because this is, in my opinion, the future. Question and answer, up with the hands. First question here, or where was the first question? First question here.
Okay, thank you, Michele. Very interesting. But this is basically you getting worried that companies are using greenwashing techniques, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we all know that during the 2 presidencies of Trump, the second one, as soon the first day, he decided to remove the Paris Agreement on climate change. So actually, it's not really greenwashing. So if I am Microsoft, I am based in America. If I am Facebook, if I am Apple, if I am part of Alphabet, I don't really care about this anymore. This is just a report. When I know that my president is literally shitting on everything that's been done, why should I care?
Well, I guess it's very jurisdiction dependent. I agree. Probably, you know, when it comes to the US, that's not really a big deal. On the other hand, you know, for example, in European Union, theoretically, companies caught doing greenwashing may be subject to a fine corresponding to up to 4% of their revenues. For the time being, I mean, they've not been enforced for such a big element. But yeah, more and more, you know, there are jurisdictions that are actually starting to impose fines for greenwashing, for example, in Australia. And I would say, yeah, pretty much it's difficult for a global company not to be somehow subject to some kind of greenwashing regulation. That being said, I agree that many times, very transparently, when we are having the discussion, regulators, they find it very regulators or banks or investors, they find it very interesting, but the sense of urgency is not there so much. On the other hand, I feel like it's somehow the kind of discussion you should have around, you know, implementing some elements of generative AI in your company, in the sense that companies are just so slow and struggle to adapt, you know, to these new technologies, that the moment you have the urgency, you may not be ready to actually being able to use them.
Next question here.
Ciao Michele, thank you so much for your presentation. My questions are, who are your customers and what is your business model?
Okay. Thank you. Ciao Damiano. Thanks for the support and for hosting. So yeah, for the time being, we have one big customer, the Financial Conduct Authority. Then we are aiming for the UK regulator, basically. We are aiming for asset manager investors. And a third layer basically is composed by companies that somehow, before publishing something on their social media or publishing a financial report, they want to run an internal check. We have a subscription model that is somehow depending on the quantity of companies that you have to analyze. Long story short, that's it. But yeah, that's somehow very, very simple. You know, that's a web-based application, and for any company, yeah, now in half an hour we can generate a greenwashing report as long as we have the public data which is available. And that's why, you know, for example, we have listed companies because it's easy to find, you know, reports, they're public, and we don't have to worry much about GDPR or elements like this because we're just analyzing public data, basically.
Next question here.
Hello, Michele. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is somehow related to your question. As far as I understood from your last answer, you offer your services to companies. So is it possible to have access to greenwashing KPIs as a normal guy when I'm interested to see, for example, if my employee does greenwashing or just for research issues?
I think technically, I mean, yeah, definitely it's feasible as long as you have public data or, yeah, available data. The data doesn't necessarily need to be public. If it's private data in your company and you can use it, it can be used. I mean, that being said, we have been thinking, just to give you, you know, a more general idea of getting funding to be able to provide a public watered down version of these to the public so that people can independently analyze companies and identify greenwashing.
Actually, I'm a little bit surprised that your results are not public, because I would think that the biggest point is to make this public.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting comment. Let's put it this way. We are not the police, we are supporting the police. We were thinking about, finding something bad about a specific company and then maybe starting to post on it. But no, at the end of the day, it's not an approach we took. And again, we obtained this greenwashing result, and it's up to the regulator to decide what to do. Then, I mean, at the end of the day, like every AI solution, it's up to you to decide what to do. And, the element of human in the loop is super important. I mean, for as much as I love the idea of AI agents, agentic AI, for the time being, it's not reliable to say you get an output and you automatically use in the next step of the process. Unless, it's a very controlled environment for very easy decisions. I don't know, then. Any other questions?
Yes, there's 4 questions lined up, and we only have 10 minutes left. So please, short questions, short answers. Michele is going to be here at the bar later after the presentation. Next question right now.
Hello, thank you. Good evening. So you mentioned that you make that report and put it on the blockchain later, and that report is also made by AI, which is automatically scanning the comments and basically summarizing them and comparing them to each other. Now,
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I guess in some cases you also have pictures or videos or screenshots or graphs which you would like to save on the blockchain. Can you share which blockchain you use for that and which AI you actually use for comparing?
Well, let's say for the time being, we realize, that the choice of the blockchain, I mean, we went for Solana, but, we have somehow limited requirements on the blockchain. Many times what we do is we just save the hash of the report on the blockchain. And therefore, from a data perspective, it's somehow limited. When it comes to the AI model, that's somehow the challenge, in the sense that what is working very well now may not be working very well tomorrow. So that's somehow a constant check from that perspective. So in a way, for the time being, we are using between OpenAI and Perplexity, basically, which are working really well. And I mean, yeah, maybe it's something I didn't mention, but I think it's important to mention. The good thing, basically, as we have somehow a relatively small size database to analyze, we have somehow, a controlled database. So in a way, we don't have hallucinations, because the process is somehow very similar to RAG, Retrieved Augmented Generation. We have a controlled database. We don't have hallucinations. So, and in a way, from the database, we are actually able to connect to an external data source and basically finding the phrase in the context of where it was, identified in a specific report. So imagine you are the regulator and you want to see where a specific phrase was found. Basically, we have a click-through to the database of a UK listed company, and basically you can identify the phrase in the specific document. That being said, I mean, still elaborating on your phrase, we are working on other modules that are somehow more and more complex, video to text, it's somehow feasible. But yeah, for sure, I would say artificial intelligence is still somehow struggling to define, for example, in phrases, a specific image, for example. So, but yeah, the idea is somehow being able to extract text from video, then context from images. But yeah, many times, I mean, the struggle is somehow around tables and the way they're structured. It's very difficult to have them in a machine-readable format.
Okay, we have 3 more questions lined up, and we kind of need to speed run a little bit, but
Okay.
like you can take it on one-on-one in a greater detail later,
Okay.
maybe.
Yeah.
Next question here.
How I heard that the framework is going that it will be machine readable in order that AI can work on it. The other question is that I understand that currently your clients are mostly companies, but are you aiming to extend it for social washing and other part of the ESG and become like a rating agency which is, you know, getting regulated by the EU? For example, in Hungary, we have already rules and accreditation for rating agencies and advisory in ESG. What is your aim? Where do you see yourself?
I would say probably I'm going to answer you more from a from a marketing perspective, in the sense that we are aware the tool can be extended to other contexts, like the one I was mentioning before, you know, identification of sexual misinformation in social media or definition of ESG ratings. But on the other hand, from a marketing perspective, we probably don't want to go and compete with a much larger audience. Whereas here, I mean, it's good. We developed it with couple financial regulators. We won a prize during the Sandbox Tech Sprint. Now we can officially say that the Financial Conduct Authority is a client of ours. So it's a good narrative when it comes to greenwashing for regulators. And then, yeah, I'm not sure I understood the question of machine-readable text.
Sorry, it was just a comment that I was on a training with KPMG Hungary, and they told us that the aim is that, you know, all the data will be like machine readable and in that format that, you know, not only, and they won't look like now a ESG report, like, you know, a marketing document, which, I mean, you don't need, currently, unfortunately, you don't need AI to find any discrepancies. In the weekend, I just analyzed one of the pharma companies in Hungary. It was a tragedy. I mean.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And there are some standards being developed as well, you know, for this kind of information. So, yeah, like XML or something like this, so that it's understandable. I mean, yeah, machine readable, yeah.
Next question here.
I will try to be very short. My question... No, I would like to build on the comment of Franco about Trump and the regulation on about climate changes, rejecting the idea that it exists as an issue. But in my opinion, I would like to ask your opinion. Irrespective of the legislation, greenwashing can be considered an illegal or unethical way to do marketing. So irrespective of an obligation prescribed by law, it's still relevant because shouldn't be allowed a company to attract investors, posting or publishing intentions to act in favor of or against the climate change while I'm not doing it. So what do you think about that? Thank you.
I agree, you know. I think there's always to consider, you know, on the one hand, there's the regulatory perspective, and on the other hand, as you said, you know, there's the ethical, there's the internal values one. So it's like somehow connected to, you know, before I was mentioning CO2 offsetting, there are companies that are voluntarily making CO2 offsets, you know, even though no one is making that mandatory to them. So I think it's also a question of the kind of companies, you know, you're targeting. So it's somehow very different in terms of value if you are Patagonia or if you are Shell. So yeah, I mean, regulation for sure it's creating a big push, but yeah, nevertheless, even when it comes to asset management, we often hear, that they want to somehow make sure that there's no greenwashing there, even though they may be aware that the risk is not so high for them.
Okay. This was the last question, unless somebody has there's a really urgent question over there. And that will be the closing question. Whoops.
Okay, thank you for the talk, first of all. It's a bit of a tricky question, but let's say that there is a decentralized carbon credit marketplace and there is been wash trading on it. How would you approach that?
Sorry, what do you mean, wash
So,
trading? No.
Sometimes companies would fake volume and manipulate the market for, assets, exchanges of assets and that kind of thing. So let's say that you want to assess the legitimacy of the exchange of carbon credits that is happening on a decentralized exchange. Is that outside your scope, or is that something that you could assess? Because
we didn't think about it, but nevertheless, I think as long as you have some kind of documentation, with text that can be analyzed, and I'm pretty much aware, that there are many instances where people are not doing what they're claiming they're doing.
I just want to thank the last supporters that we didn't manage to mention in the beginning. In the beginning, we were announcing the bid research that are currently open for new traders, and actually one of them is here right now. If you are interested to talk to them, there's Risis. They are based here in Malta, and if you intend to build anything into Web3, space, go and talk to Simply Staking. We are going to be here next week talking about ownership of decentralized infrastructure of the new internet. It's blockchain. Thank you very much, Michele.